On this episode, we listen to Brian Stettin from the Treatment Advocacy Center. He stopped by at the CIT Knowledge Network to give a presentation about his work on assisted outpatient treatment and what he does with the Treatment Advocacy Center. I hope you guys enjoy.
Assisted outpatient treatment is just by way of explaining who I am and what my interest in this is. So I'm an attorney. I'm the policy director for this organization based in Arlington, Virginia, called Treatment Advocacy Center. And we are basically a legal advocacy group. We work to change laws around the country to remove barriers to treatment for people with severe mental illness who are not able to volunteer for treatment because of their inability to understand that they have a need for it. So we're focused on not on the mentally ill community at large, but that kind of subset that have that particular problem and issue and need to get involuntary help. And so one of the main things that we have really focused on is getting these laws passed, assisted outpatient treatment laws, as New Mexico has now joined that club, becoming the 47th state. We still have 4 to go, including, 47 including DC have it. So we have 4 more that don't of the 51. The other part of this is once these laws are in place, we've got to get people using them because the sad truth is a lot of AOT laws around the country are laws in name only. They're on the books, but not a whole lot of use is being made of them. So we're trying really hard to make sure that does not happen in New Mexico. So for as many trips as I've made here in the last couple of years to get this law passed, I'm going to keep coming back until we see this actually happening in practice around the state. So just to give you start with a little of my background in this issue. I was an assistant attorney general in New York State, kind of just a few years out of law school. It was actually the eve of my first day on that job, coming into the attorney general's office with a new administration that had just been elected previous election day in November. So it was the new year. We were coming in to start this new administration. And on that Sunday night before my first day of work, there was a horrible tragedy in New York City where a young woman named Kendra Webdale was pushed into the path of a oncoming subway train in a Manhattan subway station by a young man right about her own age, late 20s, by the name of Andrew Goldstein, who had schizophrenia. And this horrible incident was obviously on the cover of the New York tabloids as I rode the subway into my first day at work that day. And what was clear even from the very beginning was that this individual who committed this act really was a ticking time bomb in a lot of ways. And people who had interacted with him in the criminal justice system and in the mental health system were not shocked that he had it in him to do something like this. Not that he had ever acted out quite this dramatically before, but he had a history of cycling in and out of treatment and being arrested for hostile acts and violent acts before. So obviously there was this sort of question on everyone's minds: why was somebody in this condition basically roaming the streets completely unmonitored? And so the brand new attorney general, my boss, was really under pressure to figure that out. And so on my very first day, before I even had an office, I was asked to come up with some kind of proposal over the next few weeks, really in a great hurry, for the Attorney General to propose something that might address this tragic situation. And I knew absolutely this is just a clip from the newspaper and New York Post just a couple of days later, where you see the Attorney General telling the press that he's asked people in his office to look into whether something in state law should be changed. Those folks in his office were basically me. And I knew absolutely nothing about the mental health system. I had to give myself really a crash course in it in just a very short time. And one of the organizations I reached out to and connected with was the group I wound up working for now. I wound up having a career in New York government that lasted about 10 more years, but I stayed in contact with the Treatment Advocacy Center, who helped me write this law in New York, and eventually wound up making this my cause around the country. But what we figured out pretty quick about New York law that just seemed wrong was that basically a person who had a history of cycling in and out of treatment and not adhering to the medication that was prescribed to them, basically at any one point in time was either in one state or another, right? They were either at that moment dangerous to themselves or others, in which case they could be and hopefully would be hospitalized. But during that hospitalization, they were given medication, their condition would improve to the point where they were no longer actively imminently dangerous. And at that moment, they had a constitutional right, in New York as remains true everywhere, to be released from the hospital. But once they were released, they had the same rights and privileges to refuse treatment and go fall back into that same pattern of behavior that would inevitably land them back in the hospital, just like anybody else would. And so you either had complete freedom to make your own treatment decisions, or you had no freedom at all and were hospitalized and confined. And so, we could see, obviously, this was leading to this situation where people were just going through this vicious cycle again and again, because nothing was really being done to arrest that cycle. And so this kind of leads us to the philosophical underpinnings of this law that we developed in New York. And I just want to sort of get into the basic premises behind it before going into exactly what the law is and what it says. And these basic premises are not going to be revelatory, certainly to anybody who's listening to me now. But I just want to talk about them a little bit. And the first is that non-adherence to mental health treatment, that is, people not taking their meds or doing the other things that their doctors prescribe for them when they release them from hospitals, has severe consequences of various types that we'll get into. And secondly, what may I think be a little bit less well known is why this happens. The leading cause of treatment non-adherence from the research that we have is something that is known as anosognosia. Not an easy word for any of us to say, but it's basically a clinical term for lack of insight. It means an inability to understand that one is ill and needs treatment. So let me sort of start with this first premise, the consequences of non-adherence to treatment. And the first one that you folks are all dealing with on a regular basis is violence and crime. And this is a point that makes a lot of mental health advocates that I deal with and work with from other organizations nervous to talk about. I totally understand why. None of us want to perpetuate stigma and have the general public be afraid of people with mental illness. They should not be afraid of people with mental illness as a general matter. And so often in the wake of horrible tragedies that occur that are committed by people with mental illness, you see mental health advocates rushing to point out that people with mental illness are no more dangerous than the general public. Studies show this again and again. And as a general matter, that is true. However, if we just leave our analysis at that point, we're papering over some unpleasant truths that I think we ignore at our own peril, because there are two things to know about why that is true. First of all, people with mental illness is a vast category. It includes probably some people who are around this table and are out there, right? I mean, there's all kinds of mental illnesses, and I think 1 in 5 people are estimated to have a mental illness of some kind, and that includes things like anxiety and depression and OCD, all kinds of conditions that no one would ever suggest is going to cause you to be psychotic or delusional or would realistically lead to violence. And so the population of people with severe mental illness is actually a lot smaller. And when you look at severe mental illness, things like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, even then, most people are not particularly prone to violence because most people with those conditions are under treatment for it. And the studies tell us that treatment really eliminates the risk statistically that someone is going to commit a violent act. People under treatment for severe mental illnesses really are no more likely to commit violence. So when you push all that away and just look at that much smaller subset of folks whose mental illness is both severe and untreated, nobody can tell you with a straight face that those are not risk factors. That's not a group that we should be worried about as far as violence and crime goes, because it is. In fact, it's estimated that untreated severe mental illness is a factor in about 10% of the United States homicides. And of course, more commonly, untreated severe mental illness leads to more prosaic forms of crime, right? Assaults, property crimes, drug crimes that people commit in the course of trying to self-medicate, the things that you guys are dealing with every day. And so I really think I understand why we don't want stigma, but we're not really helping the people that we care about when we overlook the fact that untreated severe mental illness really does have these effects. Another important consequence of non-adherence to treatment that we certainly saw in the case of Andrew Goldstein that I talked about earlier is this frequent hospitalization, this revolving door where you can only keep people in a hospital until you can stabilize, as long as they're not dangerous to themselves or others. But when you keep releasing them without dealing with this non-adherence problem, it makes rehospitalization inevitable. And so you see people who have been hospitalized an unbelievable number of times going through this vicious cycle. And the most disturbing aspect of this is that we're really doing terrible harm to these folks medically by letting this go on, because what we know is that each successive psychotic break that a person goes through, it takes a toll on the brain, and it pushes recovery, the possibility that that person's going to be able to lead a meaningful, gratifying life in the community. It pushes that goal that everyone would have for their loved one further out of reach, because it's just that much more damage that has been sustained to the brain. And so, when you see someone who's been hospitalized 20 and 30 times, which is not uncommon.
Brian, let me just want to point out one thing. If you guys see SMI on there, it's severe mental illness.
Yes.
In case you guys don't know, we use tons of acronyms in law enforcement. Right. So that's not a law enforcement acronym. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Thanks for pointing that out.
And then there's this other third kind of major consequence of non-adherence to treatment, which is, the fiscal impact. And if you want to be just completely cold-hearted about it and look only at, what this is doing to our city and county and state budgets, the impact is enormous, because, these other two consequences that I talked about lead to the need to hospitalize people again and again, arrest people again and again, incarcerate them. These are all enormously expensive, as you all well know. And so it's fair to say that these patients who are caught in this revolving door are really stressing both the criminal justice system and the mental health system beyond the breaking point. So why is this happening? What is the main reason why people who have such an obvious need for mental health treatment have such a hard time, in many cases, adhering to that? What the studies tell us is that the main factor in this is a symptom of brain dysfunction known as anosognosia. And anosognosia basically means an inability to understand that you have an illness and have a need for treatment. It's a lack of insight. It's often mistaken for denial, right? You often hear people say, well, my son is in denial about being mentally ill. We need to understand that's not what this is here. Denial is a basic common human defense mechanism that we all practice from time to time, right? When you're in denial about something, you know the truth deep down, but it's some painful truth that you have reason not to want to admit to yourself. And so you might need somebody's help, a good friend or maybe even a therapist to help you coax that reality to the surface and admit it so that you can face it and move on. That's not what's going on with people with anosognosia. They don't know the truth deep down. They are certain to their core that they don't have an illness. And this is a brain-based neurological condition. It is out of the individual's control. And it's important to understand that, because nothing that I say about people who don't adhere to their treatment should be interpreted as blame. Because if you understand it from the point of view of a person with anosognosia, it's perfectly logical that they're not adhering to treatment, that they don't want to take their meds. These meds often have unpleasant side effects. And, when you can see the bigger picture, you may hate those side effects, but you recognize that they do more good for you than harm. And so you're going to find a way to live with them. But when you're only seeing the bad and don't see a good because you don't see any particular problem of yours that it's solving, of course you're not going to want to take those meds. Of course you're going to tell yourself, well, whatever the doctor says, he's the crazy one. I don't need this. And so that's what people do for very understandable reasons. The question is, what are we going to do about it? How can we help them based on our ability to see what they cannot see? And this is another interesting slide before I move on from anosognosia, just to show what researchers have learned about it in terms of this being a brain-based medical condition, no more the person's fault than any other medical condition they might have. Here you're looking at brain scans of two people with schizophrenia, one of whom has anosognosia, an inability to recognize their illness and the other one who doesn't. And I should be clear, there are many people with severe mental illness who don't have this particular problem and do adhere to treatment voluntarily. And when these two individuals were asked to perform a self-reflective activity, their brain activity was measured in these pictures you see here. And if you look at the picture on the right, the person who has insight, you see actually can map and see brain activity occurring that is not occurring in the other person. You can actually see synapses firing in a way that the other person doesn't have. So this is real, and this is medical, and this is something that we're learning more about all the time. There are also studies that link this particular problem of anosognosia to non-adherence to treatment. And we don't want to oversimplify. There are other reasons that people don't adhere to treatment. Sometimes it's just a matter of not having enough resources to get them the treatment that they need. But there was a study about 10 years ago that looked at 300 people who have a chronic non-adherence problems. And again, it wasn't all of them that had this inability to see that they had an illness. When they interviewed them and asked them about their illness, they found about a third of them would say and seemed quite certain that they were not sick. So that's not most. But when you actually drill down a little further and look at the nature of the problem that third had, you found that is, of the sample of 300, that is the third that had the most significant problems with non-adherence to treatment. That is, they had significantly longer non-adherent episodes than the other 2/3 of the sample, were more likely to completely stop taking their meds as opposed to not taking enough, tapering down. They were more likely to have severe symptoms from their mental illness, more likely to be hospitalized. And so, this linkage is pretty clear, and this is really the problem that we're trying to solve. And I think this really gets us to an important point, which is a debate that we have in the mental health community all the time. There's a lot of people who argue that the only real problem we have with the mental health system is that you don't have enough resources out there, right? If you build a great system of community care, people will come flocking to it. Just like that corny movie, corny in more ways than one, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come, we are told. And I don't mean to be completely dismissive of that point, because there is some truth to it. The fact is, our community-based mental health systems are shamefully under-resourced. And there are lots of folks out there who would do better if you just made more services available to them. So we can acknowledge that, but we also have to recognize at the same time, based on what we know about anosognosia, that for this most challenging subset of people, it's not enough. Yes, we should build it. Yes, we should make those services amply available. But if you do just that, some people still won't come because you're offering them help for a problem that they don't recognize that they have. So of course they're not going to avail themselves of that. For this group, you got to do something a little more. I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit. And so that's where AOT comes in. AOT is a legal strategy to address this non-adherence problem that we're talking about. And again, it's not intended or designed for most people with severe mental illness. It is very specifically for this small subset that are caught in this revolving door that we're talking about. The concept, we're going to define it broadly because this is something, as I said, we have on the books in 47 states, and there are variations in the way this works. And I'll talk specifically in a bit about how we've structured it in New Mexico. But the basic concept here is a form of civil commitment to treatment. So we're all familiar with civil commitment to inpatient treatment, which is based, as we've said, on a finding that a person is dangerous to themselves or others at that moment. This is civil commitment, a court order that binds a person to outpatient treatment. And just like inpatient commitment, it has to be based on very specific criteria. But here, we're not looking at the person's current condition so much as we're looking at what their history, tells us is likely to happen to them in the near future if they're left to their own devices. So in most places that have these programs in place, this is typically imposed at a point when the person's actually doing pretty well. This is usually sought as a commitment upon discharge of the person from the hospital when they've been stabilized. And so you're not saying that we need this commitment because of how they're doing right now. They're actually doing well. But we're saying, based on a look back at what they've been through in the recent past, we think we need to commit them to this kind of outpatient treatment because of an unlikelihood that they are going to comply with treatment voluntarily. And usually in these state laws, including New Mexico's, you have to show, there's an objective part of this where you have to show that the person has, in the last couple of years, in New Mexico, we say in the last 4 years, their non-compliance with treatment has led to one of 3 very specific outcomes, either 2 or more hospitalizations, or an episode of violence, an incident of violence, which could have been criminally charged or not, or alternatively, a very long hospitalization, which, from what I've been told, doesn't occur very often in New Mexico, unfortunately. But a hospitalization of 6 months or more caused by noncompliance is also potential grounds for this, at least in theory. And so this petition is made to the court by someone authorized to make it. Usually it's a treatment professional involved in discharging that person or family member. And it is accompanied, it's not just a petition making this allegation, attached to it is a treatment plan that's been designed for this person based on a very recent psychiatric examination of them and a discussion of them with them of what their treatment needs are. And in this treatment plan, you're laying out a very specific list of services, comprehensive approach to all the medications and services that person needs to survive safely in the community. And with the best of these state laws, including the one we just passed in New Mexico, you also require in the treatment plan that you identify the specific providers who have been lined up for each of these services. So this is not just something theoretical. The court is not just committing a person to something hollow that doesn't exist, but you have a very specific set of services and people who have said in the community, I'm qualified to provide this service, and I'm going to do it if you, the court, order it. So this gets submitted to the court. It leads to a hearing at which the patient is entitled to representation by an attorney, and they have full, obviously, due process rights to challenge the evidence if they want to. Although I got to say, usually that's not what happens. In a typical case, I've visited a lot of these programs around the country, and what I've seen, what happens most often is that the person is viewing this as a ticket out of the hospital. They're in a pretty good place at this moment. They like the idea that these services are available. They may actually, even if they have anosognosia, even if they lack insight into their illness, they're viewing this as a ticket out of the hospital. And I should also mention that anosognosia is not always fixed. For a lot of people, it's something that waxes and wanes. They may understand at that moment that they have an illness. But the question is, are they going to be able to hold on to that understanding a couple of weeks later? And so what you often have at these court hearings is the person is stipulating to all the facts. They're agreeing that they have this need. And so the hearing moves very quickly. There's not really like an adversarial approach that you might see in another kind of court hearing. You get very quickly to the point where the court can issue its order. And this is really the good part. I mean, has a lot to do with why we feel this works. The court then uses its sort of power as its bully pulpit to give that person a pep talk, a motivational speech, and let them know that complying with this treatment is something that's expected of them, and that the court and everyone who is part of the treatment plan is there to help them. And so you have this court order where it's not just one-sided. The two sides are really committed to each other because the treatment plan gets incorporated into the court order. So those providers are every bit as much on the hook to live up to their obligations as the patient. So what is this about? What are we trying to accomplish here? It's a really important thing to understand that this is unlike any other court order that you may be familiar with. Typically with court orders, the point is the teeth behind them, right? The idea that people understand that if they don't obey what the court has instructed them to do, they could be held in contempt of court, which could lead to being jailed or being fined. We actually specifically prohibit that in most of these state laws, including our new one in New Mexico. We say that a person cannot be held in contempt of court for violating this kind of court order. To allow that would be counterproductive because we're trying to create here a pathway out of jail, not establish a new pathway into jail where we're going to throw people in jail because they haven't followed their treatment. So that's not what this is about. Now, I understand that it makes a lot of people wonder, well, what is the point? If this court order has no teeth, if it's in fact all gums, what are we accomplishing? Isn't this all sort of an empty exercise? And I would say very strenuously that it's not, that there is a lot of point to what we're doing here. I'll just go through what the points are in theory, and then we'll look at some of the research that's been done on programs that exist around the country. So the main purpose that we're trying to accomplish through these court orders is one I've alluded to already. It's something we call the Black-Robe Effect. And the theory here is simply the idea that being told to do something by a judge has an impact on a lot of people. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. I'm not suggesting it has an impact on everybody. There are people for whom this just doesn't work. Judge tells them to do something, and judge means nothing to them. They don't care. And, this is not going to save everybody. But again, we get into the research, but the idea here is that there are plenty of people, if not everybody, who do take seriously something that is said to them by a judge. And just the ritual, the mere ritual of going through this court hearing and having this judge as sort of this independent authority figure, listen to both sides and reach this conclusion and use the words, "You are hereby under court order to do this. And when you come back into my courtroom, I want to hear good things, not bad things." That makes an impression on people. And so we call that the Black-Robe Effect. And this really depends on the judge sort of embracing that role and taking seriously and kind of playing it up, to be honest with you, using that in the hearing to make an impression on the person that's being put under this court order. That's the first part. The second part of this is we're trying to light a fire under those treatment providers, to communicate to them that this is a important case, that this is somebody who requires intensive case management and intensive monitoring, who has been prioritized based on their history of failing under treatment that's been offered on a voluntary basis before. And so there's something that happens within the provider community. They may have a stable of people who they work with, but the idea is that when they understand this one group of their client base are the AOT patients, the people who the court has said are required to receive this high level of care, that makes an impression on providers and leads to them providing a more serious level of monitoring. And the third purpose we're trying to achieve here is to facilitate a rapid response to a person's non-adherence to treatment. I mentioned that there is no punishment involved in AOT for violating the court order, but that is not to say that there should be a sense that there's no consequence for violating the court order. In fact, there should be a very swift consequence to the person, and that is that they should be brought in, and the law makes this pretty clear, sets out a process for this. If there is reason on the part of the treatment team to believe that their AOT patient has not been following the court order and in a material way, and they've made good faith efforts to get that person to comply, and they don't seem to be responding to that, the law sets out a process where the treatment team is supposed to inform the court of that fact and to bring that person back in for an evaluation, basically a short-term hold, a 72-hour hold, to determine whether it's now necessary to change that, modify that court order into a hospital order, into an inpatient commitment. Now, sometimes during that 72-hour hold, not surprisingly, you're going to find that this person who's off their meds, in fact, is now dangerous to themselves or others, needs to be hospitalized. Other times you'll find that they aren't. You can't automatically recommit them to a hospital. You have to do this good faith evaluation. But the mere act of being brought back in to the hospital, that inconvenience, that hassle, you might say, and additionally that just opportunity to reconnect with your doctor and sit across the table and talk about what's gone right, what's gone wrong, be reminded of your obligation to the court. That alone, we hope, and again, we'll look at the research, in many cases is going to make an impression on a person and get them back on the right track, even if you ultimately can't keep them in the hospital on a longer term basis. So that's, those are the basic ideas. That's the theory behind this and why, we hope in any particular case that this is going to work despite the fact that the court cannot use its usual powers to enforce its court order. So let's then turn to what the research tells us about how well this actually works. And what you see here, just the cover of a couple of reports that have been done in New York that I'm going to talk about. We did not create the first AOT law of its kind in New York. I mean, there were at that time already about 30 states that had AOT in some form already on the books. So as you often do when you're crafting state laws, we did a lot of cribbing, taking good ideas from this place, that place, cobbling it together to create something new. The one kind of unique thing that we did, because we saw that a lot of these laws were not used a whole lot, as good as they might have looked on paper, is we did create in our program, in our law in New York in 1999, a requirement that every county in the state must establish one of these programs. In other words, we didn't make it optional for local mental health systems to use this power the way it is in other places. And we were able to get some funding from the state to keep that from being an unfunded mandate that was funneled out to the counties across the state to actually put this program in place. And we created this infrastructure within the state Office of Mental Health to oversee and monitor those programs. Lamentably, we haven't been able to do all that part of it because the money involved in the other states since then, including New Mexico, that we've gotten these laws passed. So in other states, we've had to look for other ways to try and get this implemented on a more comprehensive basis. But in New York, because of that, you have this situation where almost immediately, certainly over the first couple of years, every county in the state, especially in the major population centers, established these fairly robust programs. So that gave you a lot of data to study. And we also were fortunate in that we were able to get into the law a requirement to have studies performed, because there were skeptics that said that this was going to be a terrible thing for reasons I'll get into. And to quell some of that opposition, they put a sunset on the law. They said this law is going to expire in 5 years, so it would expire in 2005. And just before it would expire, there was a requirement that the New York State Office of Mental Health would issue a report to the legislature on how well the law had worked over its first 5 years based on data that the counties were required to report to the State Office of Mental Health. Okay, so we got that first study in 2005 based on this data reported from the counties, and you can just see for yourselves some of these numbers. When you looked at the first 6 months that people spent under AOT and compared it to how they did in the 6 months prior to that, really eye-popping, unbelievable declines in all these harmful behaviors that lead to people being arrested and people being hospitalized. Really, to be frank, more impressive results than we even expected. And again, it doesn't mean you're getting to everybody. You can see in these numbers that there's still lots of people who were not being helped even by this. But this is a very highly challenging population. And the fact is, to get results this good, it just outperforms any other approach you could possibly take with this particular high need population. So this was really phenomenal news.
Just for a couple of the guys on the phone, what are some of these stats?
Oh, sure.
Because they can't see them.
Thanks for pointing that out.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I forgot.
A lot of them are.
I forgot that there were people who could not see this. So thanks for that, Matt. So what we have here are findings that 55% fewer of the recipients of AOT engaged in suicide attempts or physical harm to self. 49% fewer abused alcohol. 48% fewer abused drugs. 47% fewer physically harmed other people, 46% fewer damaged or destroyed property, and 43% fewer threatened physical harm to others. So with these results, we think perhaps naively thought that we were going to get this law made permanent right then and there. It didn't work out that way. Some of the skeptics and opponents actually made a couple of valid points about these findings. First of all, they said, well, these statistics are all coming from the Office of Mental Health, which is under the control of the governor, and the governor was a supporter of this law. So this is not as meaningful because it's, helping the governor politically to say this is a success. We'd be more impressed if these findings came from some independent research outfit. And they made another point, which I think was even harder to dismiss, which is that these findings don't really tell us why the program was working. Right? Because the fact is undeniably that people who were under these orders were getting a better package of services than they had in that 6 months prior. And so this came down to that argument, if you build it, they will come. Some people said, well, sure, they did better because you gave them better services. Who's to say the court order had anything to do with it? Maybe they would have done just as well if you had made those services available to them on a voluntary basis. And we didn't really have an answer to that because, it was true. So what we got in 2005 was another sunset put on the law, this time for 2010. This time it was required that OMH would have to contract out to a independent research group to perform the study. And there was a whole series of new questions that they were required to answer, including this critical question of what role does the court order itself play in the success of the program. So here are some results from that study in 2009, which came out just a year before the second sunset of the law. This study was led by a group from Duke University Medical School who got the contract to perform it. And first of all, they really confirmed these kind of amazing results in terms of how much better people were doing. I'll tick through these again for the benefit of people who can't see the screen, but it was found that the likelihood of arrest over a 1-month period was cut in half by AOT. They did an amazing comparison between people who were under AOT and a control group of folks who didn't quite meet criteria for AOT, so that they didn't get it, but were also kind of people who were seriously involved in the mental health system, and found that even though that control group had a less violent history than our AOT patients, the AOT group turned out to be 4 times less likely to commit serious violence than the control group. They also found a likelihood of hospital admission was cut in half. Over a 6-month period, they found even for those who were hospitalized, a substantial reduction in the number of days people spent in the hospital. They found that lots of the kind of fears that were raised by the opponents that said that people would view AOT as sort of a scarlet letter, a stigmatizing thing that would drive people underground and keep them from seeking treatment at all, turned out not to be true, that people who were under these AOT orders turned out not to feel particularly stigmatized or coerced by the mental health system. And then they looked at this question of whether the court order matters, which turned out to be kind of a hard question to study because, to really do it under laboratory conditions, you would have to take a group of people who met all these criteria for AOT, who had this revolving door history, and deny them the court order, the benefit of it. You would have to say, well, we'll just make these services available to you voluntarily, and let's see what happens. Basically, you'd have to make guinea pigs of people, and for obvious ethical reasons, you just can't do that. Nobody would want their son or daughter placed in that control group, given what we already had good reason to believe that AOT was something effective. So, it was an impossible question to really study in a pure scientific way. But one difference in the way the law was implemented around the state did create an opportunity to address this question. It turned out that in New York City, there was a tendency to place everybody who met these criteria under court order, whether they were receptive to being under court order or not, just because the people running the program there felt that the court order itself had value, that Black-Robe Effect of going through the court proceeding would matter in the success of this. Upstate, where their court resources were more scarce and where they had to make harder choices about how many people they could bring to court, they had a different approach, which was to give people an opportunity to join the program voluntarily. In other words, they would go up to the patient about to leave the hospital in their discharge planning meeting and say, you meet all the criteria for this law. We could go to court and get a court order, but would you like to just avoid that and join this program on a voluntary basis? And most people, seeing the writing on the wall, would take that deal and do it. Now, those people who I'm describing there are not what you call purely voluntary patients, right? Because they are responding to this coercive request that's being made of them. They understand if they say no, that they're going to wind up under court order anyway. So, the two groups are not as different as a scientist might like, but if anything, you would say that similarity, the fact that there's coercion in both cases, would make the two groups more alike rather than more different in terms of how they respond to the treatment that's given to them. And yet, even with this imperfect comparison, the researchers found very real differences in terms of how people did under court order versus not under court order. To be sure, both groups did better than they had done before, so the increased availability of services certainly had a large role in why this was working. And yet they found, for one thing, a highly statistically significant difference in hospital admission over 6 months between these two groups. They found that the AOT patients were less likely to be arrested than the voluntary patients. They found that the AOT patients had a higher level of personal engagement in their treatment. 55% of them said that they had a good or excellent engagement rather than 43%. So based on these very real differences between the two groups, the researchers concluded that, yes, the increased availability of services under AOT clearly improved recipient outcomes and is part of why the law works. However, they said the court order itself and its monitoring by the court do appear to offer additional benefits in improving outcomes. In other words, the court order adds value and has a lot to do with why this works. Another study was done, and I'm sorry some of you can't see the screen right now because I have a pretty amazing bar graph up on how much money is being saved in New York by having people under this program. We talked about the very expensive kinds of treatment that people avoid by being placed under AOT. And what they found is that if you look at how much is being spent on things like outpatient mental health treatment and medications, yeah, there is a modest increase in spending on this group once you place them under AOT, but that increase is dwarfed, extraordinarily dwarfed by how much you are saving on avoided hospital costs. And one thing this study unfortunately didn't look into is how much is being saved on the avoided cost of arresting and incarcerating people. That's another study we hope to see performed someday. But just in terms of not having to hospitalize people, when you add up the areas where you're spending more and then subtract the areas where you're spending less, that is hospital days, you find that in net, that the total treatment costs for this group declined 43% in the year after these folks were put under AOT. And then if you look to the second year, by which time some of these individuals have graduated from the program, others have their court orders renewed and stay in it, you find another 13% decline from that, even from the first year savings in the amount of money being spent on people. And so that has reverberations throughout the entire mental health system in terms of being able to serve more people because you don't have these high utilizers consuming this wildly disproportionate share of the scarce resources that are available. And so because of some of this research, we've reached the point now where this is really not as controversial as it was before. A lot of the controversy over this has really dissipated and been neutralized by the studies, to the point where a federal agency called SAMHSA, which administers mental health grants on behalf of the federal government to states and local governments, has now admitted into their National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, NREP, AOT. AOT is now an NREP certified practice, which states are encouraged to look at. NREP basically exists for the purpose of giving states ideas of how to spend their block grant funds. So having AOT mentioned there and cited there as an evidence-based practice is the federal government's way of giving states the green light to use those block grant funds on funding AOT, which we're seeing more and more is happening. It's a really exciting development that came through last year. And again, it's just based on a clear-eyed evaluation of the research, ignoring all the rhetoric and some of the emotion that this subject sometimes generates. Similarly, NIJ, which you all know is a division of the Department of Justice that's sort of a research think tank on criminal justice issues, has also on their website, crimesolutions.gov, certified AOT based on the studies that we've provided to them as an effective strategy for reducing crime and violence. So these two federal agencies have really given AOT their stamp of approval, and has had a lot to do with why we've had momentum in the last couple of years in really getting this used more around the country. And so that leads us to the New Mexico law that we were able to get past a couple of months ago, which I know you're all really interested in seeing what's going to happen with. I have on the screen here pictures of two people who were both instrumental in very different ways in the creation of this law. You know, AOT, as I think Matt mentioned, is something that we had tried for many years to get enacted in New Mexico. The civil liberties groups really vociferously opposed it and had enough sway over the legislature that we really just failed again and again, to the point where we had really given up for a period of about 4 or 5 years. Just my organization just devoting its resources elsewhere because we were just getting nowhere with your state legislature. But in the summer of 2000, or I guess it was early in 2014, James Boyd was shot by a police officer in the Sandia foothills. And obviously that generated lots of controversy in the community about whether that shooting was necessary and appropriate. But in the midst of all that controversy, I wrote an op-ed for the Albuquerque Journal where I said, you know, wherever you stand on whether it was appropriate to shoot James Boyd, there's one thing that I think everybody can agree on, which is that, you know, this is an individual who should not have been out there in the first place. That the fact that he was camping out there and in this delusional state to the point where he could not understand what the police officer was saying to him really reflects a failure on the part of our mental health system, and it's something that really AOT could have addressed, because he was someone whose history dovetailed perfectly with this subset of people who were trying to help with AOT. And if he had been on treatment, he would not have been out there. And shortly after that op-ed ran, I received a call from a staffer for the other person who I have on the screen, a person who's become a hero of mine, Senator Mary Kay Papin, a state senator from Las Cruces, who is really regarded in the legislature as the voice on mental health issues. She has a mentally ill grandson, and she had an all-new resolve. She had been sort of skeptical herself about whether AOT is something that could work in New Mexico. But she called me with a brand new resolve that this was something that absolutely had to happen here. And so I was able to work with her in the early part of 2014 to draft an AOT law for New Mexico. We presented it the following year. We came very close to getting it passed in 2015. But we actually got it passed in both houses, but some technical differences between the bills and just running out of time kept us from getting that reconciled. So we came back this last session, and we were able finally to get this on the books in New Mexico, to the point where local mental health systems now have the opportunity to go to the court and ask to put these folks who you're all dealing with on a regular basis under an AOT court order and an AOT treatment plan. As you won't be surprised to hear, most of the resistance and opposition that we faced to getting this bill through wasn't really so much based on the ideology about what a violation of civil rights this was going to be. It really came more down to a sense that the resources were not there around the state, that because mental health is so horribly underfunded in New Mexico, that there would be no opportunity in a lot of places to offer anybody any kind of meaningful outpatient treatment plan that you could court order. And there's a lot of validity to that concern. And as I told a lot of legislators, I'd be the first to admit there's a lot of places in New Mexico where it isn't going to be possible to use this until the state makes a funding commitment. However, I did have optimism that there would be an opportunity to make this work in Albuquerque and Las Cruces. Not because services are ideal in here and in Las Cruces by any means, but because there is enough to work with. There are things you're offering people here that some individuals just aren't availing themselves of, that we could build a program around those services. Just the fact that you have ACT teams, right, that kind of wraparound approach, comprehensive approach to giving people the things they need. You can really think of AOT as just ACT plus a court order. In any ACT team, there are going to be a few people who are just not doing well under it. And if you add a court order to that package of services, we think you could do a whole lot better.
Could you briefly explain what ACT is?
Oh, sure. It's actually, Mills probably could explain it even better than me, but it's basically it's basically a team-centered, comprehensive approach to providing a person all the services they need, where you have a team assembled, each of whom has a role to play in the addressing the comprehensive needs of the individual. Is that a fair way to approach it? And so, it's really exactly what if you look at a treatment plan that gets submitted to the court for someone who needs AOT, it's essentially doing the exact same thing. So these are two programs that work very well in conjunction with each other. But another really exciting thing that came online at about the same time that we got this law passed is a new grant program from that same federal agency we've been talking about, SAMHSA. And this is something that has been a policy priority of my organization for years. And we've been lobbying Congress on it for years. And that finally did pay off a couple of years ago, where we got authorization from Congress for SAMHSA to establish a grant program to seed AOT programs in local mental health systems where there is a state law on the books authorizing AOT, but nothing really being done to make AOT happen. And so even though we got that passed into law a couple of years ago, it took another couple of years before we got Congress to appropriate the funds. It was just sort of an empty shell since 2014. But finally, in the budget for fiscal year 2016, we got not a whole lot of money, but $15 million appropriated, which we think is going to be replenished in each of the next 4 years, which the law allows, so that SAMHSA can go ahead and start making these grants. So this, as I said, we finally got the money for it just before we got the law passed in New Mexico. So the timing was really terrific. The law passed in New Mexico in March, and then in April, SAMHSA announced the availability of these funds for the first time. They put out a funding announcement with a deadline of June 16th, where they announced they were going to be issuing about 15 grants nationally, hopefully sending about $1 million to each of the recipients, each of the awardees per year for 4 years to start new AOT programs. And also each of these recipients of these grants are going to participate in this cross-site evaluation that SAMHSA is going to conduct, which is going to add to our body of knowledge, I think, about how effective these programs are. And this is open only to jurisdictions that are not doing anything with AOT now. So obviously that was perfect for New Mexico because the law was brand new. So obviously no one was doing anything with it. And I was able to work very closely with folks both in Albuquerque and in Las Cruces. And I'm happy to say that both jurisdictions have applied for these grant funds. I have a slide here about the Albuquerque application. I apologize to anyone here from Las Cruces that I don't have information up here about that application as well. But I have to say, of the groups I worked with around the country to apply for these grants, and there were about 8 or 9 of them, I really thought the 2 applications from New Mexico were among the very best. I thought they were both excellent, and I have no insight into who's going to win the awards. SAMHSA is going to make its announcements in September. But I am optimistic about both New Mexico applications, which would be tremendous, obviously, in creating really robust programs in both of these jurisdictions. So we'll see what happens. But another thing I told the legislature a couple of days ago when I gave them my update on what's happening with this is that I really feel like even if these awards don't come through, and obviously it's a crapshoot, nothing you can count on, just the process we went through in both cities of figuring out exactly what an AOT program would look like, developing a budget for it, getting all the stakeholders on board, including the judges, getting them very enthusiastic about it so that they could provide those letters of support, and answering all the questions on the application about who we're trying to serve and how serious about high utilizer problem that your jurisdiction has and how many people we think are going to need this. All that is incredibly valuable work to do, even if these awards don't come through, because it's the starting point to figuring out how we're going to fund it by other means. And I do believe that the opportunity is there, that there is going to be money available in both cities. Again, this is not something we're going to see really implemented around the state for a while, but I've been coming back here again and again for a couple of years to get this law passed, and I'm going to keep coming until we really do see this as a standard tool in the toolkit across the state for dealing with this very highly challenging population. And what I foresee is that with federal grant money or not, we're going to get programs going in the next year in Las Cruces and Albuquerque. We have a sunset on this law too, just like in the New York one I talked about. This one's going to expire in 2020. And by that time, I hope to have really meaningful results about how well this is working in those two cities, which will inspire the legislature and governor at that point. Maybe this is I think we're going to get the law made permanent at that point, but maybe this is a pipe dream of mine, but I'm sure going to try to also use this as a really compelling argument for why investment ought to be made in this statewide on the state level, so that we really can make this happen everywhere. So I just want you all to know that guys, I'm looking forward to working with all of you to make this a reality. And I have my contact information up here on the screen. And I look forward to continuing to come to New Mexico until we make this the reality that I've laid out.